Trevor has an extensive background working in partnership with nonprofits for over 20 years. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of Lethbridge and his Master's in Rehabilitation Counseling from Gallaudet University, the only deaf university in the world. Investing back into his community is a core value of his personally and professionally. Trevor has volunteered thousands of hours, which included serving on a variety of local, state, and national boards. He acted as executive director for Alaska's statewide lead HIV/AIDS organization for nearly 10 years. And Trevor recently chaired the statewide commission that developed the implementation plan for the Alaska Safe Children's Act. He's a founding member of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. 7 years ago, the Alaska Children's Trust separated from the state of Alaska and became an independent nonprofit with one of the largest complex missions, the prevention of child abuse and neglect. Due to the complexity of this issue, the Trust had to find a path that utilized resources to get the highest level of return on investment while ensuring they remained within capacity limits. They still had to move forward, so they used data as an instrument to help achieve their mission. It helped them shape social norms, build bridges, and create space for conversations, challenging assumptions, shaping policy, leveraging resources, and much, much more. Please join me in welcoming Trevor Storrs. It is. Thank you. It's the violin music.
Good morning. It's a beautiful rainy day in Juneau. Left Anchorage, 70 degrees, just to come and hang out with you all. So this is great. Well, at least it's a captive audience. Nobody wants to be outside, except for maybe those who are on the cruise ship. I just got back. I had the privilege of going back home to Calgary, Alberta. My niece just graduated with a BA in psychology from Mount Royal. One, it reminded me how old I was, thinking back of 20-some years ago when I was in her position. But I was also working on this presentation, and I had a flashback. Does anybody ever remember taking a class, especially one that you had to take, and you're like, why am I in this? I'll never use this. Has anybody? Guess which class I was in when I thought that? Statistics. So I was really amazed and kind of humbled when I was asked to do this keynote related to data, and having that kind of flashback, I was just going, if only my teacher saw where I am today and how we've actually embraced, and I basically started to really learn and understand the power of data and what it can do. So it was really by paint by numbers. Anybody remember that as a kid? All right, loved it. Mom and Dad always gave us those types of things, whether it be markers or whatever. That's what we played with outside of Archie comics on our way out to whatever lake we were camping that summer. So when I was thinking about data and really the journey that the Alaska Children's Trust and even myself have personally, it really has been painting by numbers. The portrait is not done, and I've probably started over a few times, but it has definitely been going down this theme. And what I wanted to share today was really how we've been using data to guide the work of the Children's Trust. But to really understand that, I want to do a couple steps back and just explain the Children's Trust and our history. You all remember Golden Girls? Who remembers the show? All right? As in the saying of Sophia Petrillo, picture it, Alaska, 1988. They passed legislation to create the Alaska Children's Trust in name only. That was our phase one. So there was a trend across the nation to create trusts that were focused on the prevention of child abuse and neglect. There was a pediatrician, Ray Helfer, Dr. Ray Helfer, that realized, well, after seeing kids, was horrified to see that we had trusts for highways and for parks, but nothing for kids. So it was his mission to have every state have a trust. He almost achieved it. 48 states had them. We created ours in '88. We actually modeled it after Texas, and it stopped there. It was only in words. Well, in the late 90s, phase 2 hit, and that was under the direction of Governor Knowles. And he saw the power and the need to really invest in our next generation. So he tweaked it a little bit, created the Alaska Children's Trust under the state umbrella, and then also created a sister organization called the Friends of the Alaska Children's Trust. And their sole purpose was fundraising because they needed to build the trust. They first endowed it with $6 million, but wanted to see that grow. And as we all know, nobody wants to ever write a check out to the state of, correct? So they created this other organization that did all the fundraising. And they worked. And again, they worked very closely together. And their goal was to prevent child abuse and neglect. Through that time, they came together and really started having some discussions about, are we really having an impact? Our numbers haven't changed. We're doing some investment. What can we be doing? And there was a lot of questions about our endowment and how secure it was. And actually, we always said it was an endowment, but it was not. It was actually just an account in the name of the state of Alaska. And at that time, it was worth about $10 million. So with the goal of recognizing that this is a complex issue, working within a system that doesn't move easily when you have a complex issue that is ever changing rapidly, as well as our endowment not being secure, there was effort and success in phase 3, which was becoming independent. And that's what was just described earlier. So in 2012, it was all completed, and the Alaska Children's Trust merged with its sister organization, become an independent nonprofit, moved the $10 million. And we're very thankful, because I don't know if that $10 million would still be there, because it wasn't secured. Anybody could do anything with it. So they had some foresight and realized it needed to be managed to ensure the future of not the endowment, but more importantly, our children. So in 12, they completed that, and then they did their next big mission, which was hiring the first executive director or president of the company to identify what are they going to do. So I was honored with that. And I remember sitting down with them after getting the position 7 years ago and going, so what do you want? And they said, we have 2 easy things for you. 1, grow the trust. Like, okay, we can do that, fundraising. 2nd, solve child abuse and neglect. And I'm like, all right, job security, we can do this. And I walked away and I was like, wow. How do you find your way from point A to point B? Complex issue. It's not like polio. Find that vaccination and then create a way of making sure everybody gets their immunization. And polio is pretty well eradicated in not just our nation, but in this world because of great efforts. But it wasn't very complex. Figuring out the vaccination, yes, but getting it out there, not as complex. But think about child abuse and neglect. What is the cause? I get asked that question all the time. What is the cause and what do we do? If it was only that simple. It was always like looking at this roadmap. There's so many ways to go. Sometimes it's a straight line, sometimes it's turns, but it's so complex. And then with that complexity, we started having to ask ourselves questions. How do we do this effectively? How do we do this efficiently? How do we actually achieve that mission with the limited resources that we have? How do we engage others? So if we go here, we're not touching all the people over on the right-hand side of the map. How do we get them to follow us? Or how do we get back over? And how do you do all of this in a 40-hour work week with one person and a committed board of 12 to 15 people? Once again, I thought, job security. I'm going to be here for a while. And so far, so good, 7 years. But when I walked away with this, I was like, all right, what do we do? And I'll tell you, for the first few months, what I really focused in on was just figuring out what was the Children's Trust. And every time I would come back and look at this, what really developed was a fog. It was very dense, trying to figure out what is that direction. So the trick was finding that lighthouse. And unfortunately, as you can see to the far left, I didn't exactly have Siri to give me the directions, but I had to start forging a path. No matter what, looking at this map, I couldn't just allow that to make us not do anything, or more importantly, do what we have been doing. In the state of Alaska, we have one of the highest rates per capita of child abuse and neglect. That was the first data point I learned. Then I looked at them like, wow, that must be a huge number. Does anybody have an idea on an annual basis what the actual number is? Yes, this is an interactive time. You can guess.
10.
I'm the only one. 10?
10.
No. That's my goal. Wouldn't that be nice?
I said I could guess.
Yes, you can. And that's the future number. It's larger. Another guess. Little lower, much lower. It's in the thousands. 5,000. Just under that, between 2,000 and 3,000 annually. That is probably a neighborhood of New York of what they deal with. So when you think about percentage, wow. First data point, overwhelmed. But when we started breaking down that piece of data, going 2,000 to 3,000. And through data, we also know probably 80% of those are repeat customers, unfortunately. They're part of a system. So we actually know who they are. We should be able to solve this. And that's when I started getting the lighthouse, started getting the light to bust through that fog, realizing the power of data and what that could do for us. It gave me hope. Because at first, it seemed very daunting. Not just looking at that map, but thinking we are responsible for the largest number. No, it's just a percentage, and it's played with because it's per capita. But when we get down to unpacking that number, I'm like, this is manageable. We can do this. I can do this before I retire. And I know I look like I'm only 25. I've got many years. That's when you laugh and go, yeah, really? In the next 10 years, before I retire, I think we can get close to that number of 10. And one of the ways we figured out how to be able to do it is using data. And I want to talk today about how data has helped us drive our mission at the Children's Trust. But I do want to put a caveat. We are far from perfect on data. We're using it in different ways, some good, some not good. We are still learning. I'm still learning. Because remember, I was in statistics. I just made sure I passed. I don't know if I paid enough attention. So I'm still learning, but I'm very honored that we have an amazing team that actually understands this. And just so people know in the room, with us today is Andrew Cutting in the back. Raise your hand, Andrew. He is my data guy. He analyzes it all, and he actually tells me what it says. So I made sure that I found somebody that actually paid attention in stats class and brought them on so I can look good. What we learned also with data, it creates a common language. When you travel the world, math is that common language. It's standardized. Data on many parts is standardized. And when I started using it, it started being able to create the opportunities that we needed by creating that common language. And I do want to say up front as well, with that common language, I do recognize that not everybody has the same fluency, as I was just mentioning. And just because we use the same language doesn't mean it's always interpreted the same as well. So data isn't the only thing and not the only tool that we've been using, but it's one of the keys. It has been used in multiple ways. So to complex data, like breaking down child abuse and neglect, paying people to research those numbers, to just even looking at things when we're talking about doing our work, what we have to do with our donors. Looking at who's been giving and who hasn't. Simple data that we can pull up in reports. All the way to that complex stuff when I look and give it back to the researcher and say, executive summary, please. Give me that and tell me what's going on. And everything in between. It has really turned into that Swiss Army knife. It is in everything that we do. We always talk about that data in one way or another. Even informal data, as in what someone's telling us that's happening out in the community, whether it's specifically about child abuse and neglect, whether it's about relationships with our organization or relationships with staff, whatever it may be. We are constantly using it. How are we using it? Has anybody seen the photos by Heather Mitchell? So she's a photographer. I love this. I saw it on Facebook. That's where we all start. And she is the mother of a daughter, and she plays softball. And while sitting around, she was talking with the other mothers. And in conversations, the other mothers never saw the daughters as athletic. They would refer to them as girly girls. And she was like, what? No. And she decided, like, girls can still be girls and be athletic and be princesses. They can be all of it. So she took photos of her daughter's team done up as princesses while still playing baseball, showing and challenging the norm. That is probably one of the key things that data has been able to do for us. It has helped us really challenge the norms that are out there. Did other people hear that scratching? Okay. The cat wants in. And it's a big cat. So remember, exit that way. Trip the person with the blue, because you need to be in front of and not be behind. I learned that in running. When you're out running and you run into a bear, make sure you're always running with somebody slower than you. That is always the trick. So social norms. When I first started talking to people about child abuse and neglect, when you think about a parent that has neglected their child, has physically abused their child, what is a typical word to describe that parent that most people would use? I think most of you probably have a different heart, so you may not, but what are, in the typical world, what kind of parent is that? Bad. Absolutely. Only bad parents abuse their children. Well, when you walk into a room and think, okay, well, parents are bad, how you're going to approach that issue is very different. So one of the things we're very involved, who here, well, who knows about adverse childhood experiences? Trauma. Many, oh, wonderful. Not going into the history of that, that's not the presentation, but it's understanding the impact of trauma on a child. And one of the first things I learned about adverse childhood experiences is one of the typical things when a kid is acting out, what is the question that is usually asked to that child? And you probably had it yourself. When you were having that off day and you were having your tantrum, you might be having those today still, but what's the question that an adult will ask a child? I remember it all the time. What's wrong with you? Never do they ask, what has happened to you? Two very different questions. Would you ever be surprised? I remember in kindergarten, you had to line up before you went out to recess. And if you didn't line up, you didn't go. You had to be in single file. It was like almost like the Army. But there was always that one kid that stood outside that line. Tommy, get back in. Tommy wouldn't. If the teacher would have asked what has happened, might have learned that Tommy has learned. When you're in arm's reach, you get hit. He's smart enough, he's not in arm's reach. And when he is, he fidgets, he moves, he starts having anxiety, he can't, he gets out. That is a natural defense. Now the whole class doesn't get to go out to recess. He's even further traumatized and off. We ask the question, what has happened to you? Oh, makes sense. Let's not lie. You can go out that way. There's different ways we could do things. That lens. So what data started telling us and looking at is challenging that norm and understanding that parents aren't bad. So there is an amazing individual in Hess, Dr. Jared Parrish. He's been working with the LCAN link. He's been following a group of kids through a process of the past 10 to 15 years. I think it's just over 10 years now. And has really been looking at child abuse and neglect and helping us determine, quote unquote, the cause. So one of the things we've learned is that parenthood is the scariest hood you'll ever go through. Can people relate to that? Okay? Yeah. parents, when you ask them, why did you abuse your child? There was no intent. Nobody wakes up and says, today's the day. Bring that kid over. But if they're a bad person, that's what they thought. But if you reframe that and understand that, oh, something else may be going on. And through data like what Dr. Parrish has done, he's starting to help us understand life is like an elastic band. Everybody's done this. You grab an elastic band and you stretch it. Now it's got tension. If you have the skill, knowledge, and support, you could release that stress. So stress could be not having daycare. If you've got the skills, knowledge, and resources and support, you can probably find it, relieve that. But if you don't, and you still have to get to work, that stress stays there. You're dealing with your own trauma. You were raised, abused. If you're not got the skills, support, or knowledge to relieve that, it stays. And it goes on. Just like the top, look at that person stretch. What happens to an elastic band when you stretch it and stretch it? It snaps and someone gets hit. By understanding those stressors, and if we can lessen those stressors, we can get closer to the heart of child abuse and neglect. Data gave us that understanding. His data is telling us one of the key stressors of child abuse and neglect is homelessness. And many other things. It's reframing how we approach things, one, not just with the issue, but where we're going to invest our dollars. And how do we support things? Probably eight years ago, or even close to 7 years ago, we wouldn't have been asked to do this keynote because data was just a faint thought. But now it's transformed for us into that Swiss Army knife. It has really set us in motion to really be more effective, start guiding us through that crazy map. Building bridges, complex issue. We can't be to all those places, all those cities in that map. All those people aren't going to just follow us, and we can't get to all of them. And again, with a complex issue, we recognize that it can't be all us. And one of the things I learned at a very early part of my career was the only way to get to these complex issues is to find people not like yourself to work on this. We're really good at having friendships. Probably in this room, we have some common denominators. We're probably in the same circle of beliefs and thoughts. But that only makes up a partial part of the community. If we really want to make transformational change, we need to be able to build bridges with people who don't necessarily agree or think like us. And that's where that common language came in. Now, yes, I have been in the room with certain leaders that I present the data, it is clear as can be, and basically get told it's fake news. That will happen. Data isn't perfect, but it starts to set the stage, and it's harder to combat. And when I say building the bridge, I'm not suggesting building the bridge across the Grand Canyon. I'm suggesting that we started building the bridges just across the street and then across the community. The size of the bridge and the length changed as we built those relationships. And really, those relationships helped us build the other. I thought I had an hour.
No, you got 9:50.
That part I didn't know. Okay. No, I'm going to make this quick. I misunderstood that's what we were doing. My apologies. Wow, that was a fast 15 minutes. I'm like, whoa. Okay. So we really thank you. We really started looking at building those bridges. Great example is the Children's Safe Act. To get that passed, we had great leadership in the legislature, but we needed other people. We needed to do some compromise. And I remember there was one legislator, one senator that was holding it up, and we needed that vote. So privately, back room, built the bridge, shared the data. Not only did I build, he built. I gave, he gave. We met in between as the bridges can be, and we got it passed. And it was through that data. Data, nah, I just trust my gut. I've had many conversations about child abuse and neglect, and what I get shared is their own personal stories, whether about themselves or somebody that they know. One of the things we do recognize is people do base their decisions and their actions off of personal experience. We all do. We don't put that to the side, but we start using data to help people diminish the unconscious bias. It's there. We all have it. And it's called unconscious because sometimes, usually, we're not even aware of it. Data helps bringing it out. Because again, many of times we'll be talking, and we know when you start looking at just the general data, most child abuse and neglect, overrepresented in the Alaska Native community and out in the village. And then you start getting this unconscious bias. Some people would also call it a form of racism, starts surfacing. I also give them the benefit of the doubt. It's just a lack of understanding and lack of cultural sensitivity. But start going, well, their problem or part of their culture. Well, data starts helping. Again, through the work of people like Dr. Jared Parrish, he's able to take the data, formulate, and actually show that, yes, Alaska Native may be overrepresented, but when you take in these factors, the likelihood or risk of an Alaska Native child experiencing child abuse and neglect is no different than anybody else. They're the same. It's just that all these other social determinants are higher in impacting, so the risk goes up. But when you take that out, we're all the same. Data was able to help paint that picture. It challenges that unconscious bias. Another quick story. One of the things we've learned is unwanted, unplanned pregnancies, 75% of those connected to child abuse and neglect. So all child abuse and neglect cases, 75% are unplanned and unwanted. When I first started and interviewed, I was asked, what questions do you have for the board? I was in HIV/AIDS work. I asked them, and I knew this statistic. Data said, what's your stance on solving child abuse and neglect? Are you really dedicated to it? Got a round of yes, like what a stupid question. My second question was, the data says, are you ready to have conversations about reproductive health? 7 years ago, they backtracked. Alaska data was shared with them without me even saying anything. New board members were in that room, and they were like, why are we not having conversations about human development and reproductive health? From that, we have been partnering with the Health and Social Services Department and working on voluntary implementation of LARCs, long-acting reversible contraception. 7 years ago, wasn't allowed to even step foot. 5 to 6 years ago, mandated to start figuring out what our role is because of data. It challenged that unconscious bias. This is my parents. 50 years ago, they were married. And just a couple months ago, we celebrated their 50th anniversary. And I had a cutout done of them. So in the middle is their wedding photo, 6 foot tall, and then beside it, point in time comparison. That's what data has allowed us to do. So it's great to see they somewhat change. We all age, but it was fun doing that comparison. Everybody really enjoyed having that opportunity. It was one thing of seeing it on a table as a picture. There's another thing of seeing it life size. But being able to do that point in time comparison. So we're home to Kids Count, which is bringing a variety of data that already exists on the state level and federal level and centralizing around children and families. This is supported through the Annie Casey Foundation. We partner with the Department of Health and Social Services to help us do this, as well as many other organizations that give us feedback and ideas. But this, again, shows us point in time, ranking. In 2012, we were 31st out of 50 states for overall child well-being. And you can see, point in time, we've been going down. Point in time is another reference. It has given us an opportunity to gauge where we at and how are we doing, whether as an organization or as a state. And this is probably one of the most powerful things that we created, and we've been sharing with people, leaders, when we've been talking about making change, that this has caught their attention. Like, we're getting worse, not better. What do we need to do? It grabs attention. We test hypothesis. So in all this work, data gives us that ability to evaluate. And this is where we are lacking as an organization. We are not there yet. We do not have our markers. We're working on that. We're actually going through a whole theory of change process that will then give us that ability to evaluate. But to look at if what we're doing is really go back, prove it, have accountability, and then improve off of that data. And it is a tightrope going back. It's not just evaluate and do nothing, and it's not just going forward. You're going back and forth. And it is a very fine line at times because you could spend tons and tons of money on evaluation, but finding a way so it still encourages progress, but still figuring out what our path is. It's leveraged resources. So we have a small endowment. I know to anybody, $12.5 million is not small, but as I'm looking over at the Mental Health Trust Authority, who's I consider our big sister, I've been modeling the Children's Trust similar to the work they have been doing, is they have been very impactful on that. They're what, $500 million in that range? So we're pretty small. We get about $500,000. That doesn't do a lot in such a complex issue. But we've used that to leverage funds. So when I first started, we were about $400,000 through support of donors and foundations, and using the data to show not only what is the issue, but how we're going to address the issue and how you can be a part of that. We've been able to change that and have a total of about just over $2 million annually of investment to do this work now. It's gone from just myself to a team of 9 and countless interns, especially this summer. But it's not just leveraged funds, not just for us. By us giving out money, it has leveraged other funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars through our grant making has been additionally leveraged. Actually, just thinking back to some of the investments that on a federal level, it's brought in probably millions of dollars. It's also leveraging the resources of staff and the connection. Through the networking and convening that the Children's Trust does, it's not about us doing the work. It's about us, the Royal. And different people step up. It's leveraging it and guiding it. So we've been able to go from a simple organization to really a complex network, almost starting to look like that map and how everybody's starting to be connected. And that will be one of the ways we are able to solve child abuse and neglect and change it. It has guided policy. Through this data, not only the Children's First Act, or Safe Children's Act, I should say, last year, through data and looking at the impact of after-school programming, through partnership, again, with the Department of Health and Social Services and Boys and Girls Club, our Alaska After School Network, we were able to get 25% of marijuana tax revenue designated for prevention, and half of that going to after-school programming. First time in this state to truly invest in after-school programming, and think last year we were able to get them to give us money. Data was able to do that. That was a key piece of it. Data around adverse childhood experiences, the work that Pat Sidmore did when he was at the Mental Health Board, all that kind of data, and all the people around him that did data, helped get the resolution around being trauma-informed state to actually become actual legislation. We were all able to use that data and show what is happening in Alaska and what trauma-informed work could do. Again, data has and does influence policy. And we were able to get 2 things passed last year, all in one session, unheard of today. Review the monitoring data. Why bother? We're going fine, the project. Remember, more information is useful only if it is used. So it's really been influencing our culture as an organization, as I was mentioning at the front of the conversation. We've been very, very conscious of always trying to grab the data, recognizing sometimes the data is good, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it exists, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's informal. But anytime, let's use some of that data to guide our work. Let's not just go running into the fire. Let's actually figure this out and always be coming back. Again, remember that tightrope. Let's do something. Let's check back in with the data. Has there been a change? Anything new related to it, but it's greatly influenced. I see less about my gut tells me. We're using that data. I see our board asking, what is the data telling you? More and more people are going to Andrew going, I need this data. What is this telling me? I see them reaching out to other people in the data world and asking those questions as well. And when they're in meetings and people are working on things, we're seeing it also influence, whether it be us or within the group, people going, what's the data saying? It's one of the starting points. But data is not human. Get it? You guys need to laugh more. Oh my Lord. I know the jokes aren't that good, but that one is a good one. I was like, yeah, data's not human. Where there's data, there needs to be a story. Where there's a story, there needs to be data. Communication rule that has been drilled into me. So data is not the sole thing, but it helps create the story. But add the human to it, and it really brings it to life. So we always present some data, and then we make sure that there's a story, and we blend them together. That is what has allowed us to have the greatest impact. Well, anytime we put anything out on social media and there's a data point, there's always a story to it. There's a face to it. Even if there's a picture, there's something connected to that data. Numbers are just numbers, and they're boring to people. They want the story. And that, I think, now is my 15 minutes. I'm probably there.
You can keep going.
Well, I'm at the end. Now we're going to do questions. I tried to go fast.
So how wonderful is that? I mean, the flexibility is pretty impressive.
My pleasure. So, questions.
What were you most surprised about that you had a hunch, but the data showed something?
Wow, we go for the hard one. What was? So we've been actively involved in, and this will go into unconscious bias. We've been actively involved around healthcare, Medicaid. We were actually the backbone, if anybody remembers, Protect Our Care when the ACA was up and we needed to help convince Senator Murkowski. We took it on us to help be the network around getting people out to speak about healthcare. And letting her know the importance. So we're a red state. We're a red state. Red people don't like other people. They don't like health care, all that. When we started getting our polling data around it, I was very surprised at actually how many Alaskans really care about health care and how important. And especially when you looked at the old data when it was first being proposed at the ACA, and we probably remember a Senate fight election that occurred, and the center point was around healthcare, and people really weren't happy with the Democrat Senator Begich around that, and that was one of the reasons why we got Senator Sullivan. So I was very surprised when we started looking at this and looking at our messaging, actually how many people really valued healthcare. Now, of course, we needed to package it correctly, but I was really surprised at the number. I mean, over 50% of Alaskans in a conservative state that supported healthcare and wanted to ensure this ACA continues. And even today around Medicaid, that we still have that. It's just the trick of how we word it and package it. If you word it in a certain way, I'll absolutely achieve my unconscious bias that they don't support it. But if we package it in this way, we get overwhelming support. And we did, which helped influence Senator Murkowski in voting. So I was really blown away. I actually thought, like, there's no way that the people of Alaska will get behind this. We're really going to have to do grass tops because we know we could probably influence her that way. But the number of people we could get out and support and give her the calls and ask her to support it blew us away. Yes? Okay, great. So,
Trevor, we also had from chat to repeat the question.
Oh.
The microphone is with you.
Thank you so much. I wasn't even thinking about that. The first question that I was answering was what data point did I come across that was most surprising to me and was different than what I expected. The second question is related to the slide that I just put up, asking specifically, do we know what is the cause of this? So child well-being, there's multiple rankings and data points that are in this. And one of the things I would be wrong to not mention is each year, overall, I would say close to 100% of all their data is comparable, but sometimes definitions get changed and that can influence. But it's not significant enough that we feel comfortable that we can actually compare these rankings. What's really changed the most is we've had some ups and downs, but the reason we're dropping is because other states have actually been using this data and going, don't like it, we're going to change it, and do focus and do the work. We've overall just plateaued, and we've had basically the same data. We're not getting better, we're not getting worse, just others are getting smarter and more effective. And because they're getting better numbers, our ranking just keeps dropping. So that's the primary. Now, if you drill down, you'll see, oh, in this ranking, yeah, we keep going down. And then we could get into a specific cause. But when you bring it all together on a data level, it's really because we're just not doing an investment. Our state does not have any plan around prevention of child abuse and neglect, which really means making sure children and families thrive. We have no plan. We have plans for everything but our next generation. The thing that's going to cost us the most when they hit the age of 18. Just so you know, we're using this data to help encourage and hopefully by next year start formulating what that plan looks like and create the movement that we need in our state again around children. Yes?
Using your word package, to me that's using the data to tell the story, but how do you control, you can make data say anything, some people think, how do you get over that kind of little mistrust of, well, you're just saying that because this is the field that you support. So how do you verify? I know you have data, but not everybody's going to go look at those Excel spreadsheets. So how do you package trust and building that trust with users?
So the question was, how do we build the trust and belief in the data that we're providing? Because at times the misnomer is that you can make data say anything you want. Yes, anybody can. So there's a couple things that we do. Is one, making sure that our brand, when it's attached to it, is authentic. So we really do a lot around branding, building that trust. And many of the ways is building those bridges. So when I go in, and I've developed amazing relationships with people that I have really have opposition with. But because we've been able to sit down and listen, I listen to what they say. I don't go in, packaging isn't going here and shoving it down. Many of our meetings are, so what do you think? And I'm like, huh, that's interesting. Do you have any data behind that? I ask them. They're like, well, no. Would you like some? Can we help you with that? Yeah, let's get that. So they've asked for it, we get it, and then it challenges their thoughts. So that's one way. Two, by having our brand with it and really showing that we are bipartisan, we support everybody, that our support is behind the children, and we stick to that, and we're very conscious about that. That builds trust. It's trust in the brand. We buy certain things because we have a trust in the brand, and we have good experience with them. So when you buy an appliance, and that appliance really lasted good and was a Maytag, you look for another Maytag. You don't go, oh, let's try a Kenmore. I've never had a Kenmore. Brand. It's really, really important. And then lastly, making sure that we have people on our team that either know what they're talking about or make sure that we connect with people. So there's been many times going, we have no idea, but I know somebody that does, and we link them up. And we're very conscious of sometimes finding them going, you know, yeah, you need to talk to this person from this state. They're a red state. They're a red conservative thought process as well. They will be able to speak your language, and this is what they know. So we do those linkages. By doing all of those things, we build the trust, and there's less pushback. But we still get that. I don't believe that. Then we ask, well, what don't you believe? And I will always ask, what do you need to believe? They sometimes can tell me, and sometimes they can't. They tell me or tell us, then we're like, all right, we'll get that for you. Yes?
I guess in that same realm, what kind of data sources do you have issues with not having the data that you need, or like that, what would that be?
Oh, I'm looking at Andrew. He's like, oh, yeah. So there's a couple things. Sometimes, one, we don't have the data, or we don't have the analysis of the data. There is so much data out there. You all know that. And not as much attention is given to the analysis of it and doing something with it. So when we don't have it, specific to the state or the things that we're working on, we sometimes then go, do other states have it that are similar to us? Is there an example that we can maybe use as a proxy? If not, we look at, well, within the data, is there a proxy? We don't have that, but if we know these things, we can make an assumption. And then depending on the importance of it, we may then go, we don't have it, how do we invest to get it? So one of the projects we're working on, we've not seen for our state to ever do, we've never done an analysis of state spending related to children and family. It is something we've been talking about, and we run into this on a leadership level. People will go, well, there's duplication, this and this is happening. I'm like, on the surface, yes, but no. But nobody, when I go to our state and go, there's duplication being talked about, show that there isn't. They're never able to fully show because the data doesn't exist. So we're actually working on a project that will start on an annual or biannual basis to start creating kind of a report card of how we're spending our dollars in comparison to the issues. So if all the money's going here, but the issue's here, we've got a problem. Or more importantly, big investment here, it's where it needs to be, but this hasn't changed. Us starting to have the conversation, are we addressing it right, and so forth. So that's one of the ways we're doing it. Andrew, am I missing anything? I should ask you. You're my guy.
Yeah, right? I think to Trevor's point, if you have the fundamental belief next generation is really everything is perfect on a lot of things, we should be spending more energy on where our kids are at, right? The sort of the least amount of investment now can have the biggest return later, and we're just not putting effort. We need to be spending more on bridge.
Andrew was just talking about building off of the concept that I was just talking about, the project. It's important that we're investing in the prevention. Really, if we want the next generation to be successful, we need to actually invest in them, and we need to see where that investment is going. After saying, hey, do you have something to say? Forgot that you actually don't have a mic. Question?
What was one of your initial data sets? You took on the job,
Mm-hmm.
and you were doing some analysis, right? What were initial data set and a couple of challenges that had to overcome with that?
Okay. Question was, when I first took on the position, what were a couple initial data sets that I utilized, and how did what was the second piece?
Yeah, and then challenges associated with
And
that to do your analysis.
right, the challenges that I was faced with it. So actually, the first data set was even just understanding the realm of reproductive health. I will say that was the first one. So I'm a very go get it. I work for an HIV/AIDS organization, so I could show up in a tutu and a wig and have a great time. Now working for a trust, I needed to show up all dressed up in a tie and be more reserved. And I got that from the board. So when I knew this data set existed, I didn't have the Alaska data set. I had it on a national. And then through the work of Dr. Jared Parrish, he outlined basically, we knew that if you're a single female, unplanned, unwanted pregnancy, hasn't graduated high school, on Medicaid and smoke, put the money down that family's going to be part of the OCS system, Office of Children's Services. So knowing that, but yet working with a conservative board that was just like, whoa, reproductive health, it was like, okay. So my first challenge was going, how do I get data interpreted internally for people that want to solve child abuse and neglect to actually see the larger picture? And the way I did that, because I was taught, we did a data walk. So once I learned about Dr. Parrish and his data, this was a couple years later because it was the back of my head, I asked him for his data set, and he provided in slides, and I broke it up in same slides, 3 groups of my board when we were going through strategic planning. And I sent them on a data walk. We didn't have Jared talk about it. I wasn't there talking about it. They were in groups, and they had to start looking at the data and analyzing it themselves. What was the stories they were seeing? So they had to look at it and interpret it. And it wasn't a complicated data set to look at. And they were done as slides. Literally, when they came back, they started seeing and sharing what they saw. And this is when they were like, we're constantly seeing this unwanted, unplanned. This is upstream. I always talk about preventing child abuse so far upstream that we stop the glacier from melting, creating the stream. And that's when they were like, if that's our glacier, why are we always working with the parent? Why don't we work with them before they become parents? So by going through that data walk, so my initial challenge was, how do I help our board do this? So it doesn't seem, because if anybody has been in my role with a board, as much as they like, you do a great job, you know this, when I suggest something, they don't hear it. It's like a spouse. You say something, they don't hear it. An outside person says it, they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. I'm like, those are the exact same words I just used, but okay. So I figured out they needed to not just hear from me, they needed to see the data, and they needed to come to the realization themselves, and the data walk did it. So that would be our first one.
And the data, were they already being collected?
Yes. So that was all Dr. Jared Parrish. I have greatly relied on his Alcan link, and many people are. It's the one of only a couple states that are doing any type of longitudinal study around the well-being of children within the state. I highly recommend it if you actually just type into Google Dr. Jared Parrish presentation, some different videos. If you're interested to seeing the work that he's doing, there's a 60-minute video on it. The second data was really starting to break down the just understanding, like I mentioned, child abuse and neglect, highest per capita. Well, what does that really mean? And it was just challenging to start breaking it down, getting to some of the more specific, and helping people. The challenge was helping people not feel overwhelmed. Like really, 2,000, 3,000 kids is not a lot. But it seemed so complex to everybody. There's still, even today at 7 years, people are like, wait. And I'm like, no, it's only 2,000 to 3,000. Changing it and giving people that hope. It's not been easy. And I think it's partly because it's sometimes deer in headlights feeling, because it's not, even with 2,000 to 3,000, it isn't just do this and solve it. It's still very complex. And it's taken us decades to be where we are today. It will take decades to change it. But I think we can shorten it by using this data. And when we've unpacked it, that's what's given me the clarity, and it's trying to provide that clarity to others. So sometimes that's the challenge. And follow up?
So, yep. So just identifying, so capturing some initial data for last year, did you come across anything that, when it comes down to an individual, you have to de-identify it? So were there challenges and discussions about de-identifying data? So then you could actually use it for analysis purposes, but you don't know specifically the case, the person's name, et cetera.
So was there any challenges, is the question, about de-individualizing it and getting access? So one of the things I will say is we don't do a lot of internal analysis, but in conversations with folks that have worked with OCS and other numbers, one of the biggest barriers is getting access to the data to use. And I'm hoping that we get to discuss that here. Is the state is probably the home of the most data of anybody, is my guess, at least of Alaskans. And sometimes it's very hard to access because of state barriers. Some correctly, they need to be, and I'm appreciative of, it's not identifiable. But there's enough out there that you can cleanse that so it's not. But of course, they don't get down to granular like going, this village has this number, because then you can pretty well, oh, that's that family. I wouldn't know it, but somebody, if ever got the data within that village, but they can do it by region. and then it's definitely not identifiable. But of course, one of the other challenges we have, as we all know, being a small state, sometimes the data we have is not statistically large enough, and what you can do with it. So there's those challenges as well. Other questions? Yes.
Are there specific data sets that you can think of now that the state of Alaska could release that would help develop intervention for the Alaska children?
So the question is there any data sets that the state of Alaska could release to help our work? I'm not sure. Andrew, anything off the top of your head? You're the man who works with it.
The way I phrase it should be careful. So we have a very close relationship with those guys that we're doing. They work very hard and have an extremely challenging job.
Andrew, can you hit pause? Why don't you come and stand here so I don't have to try to repeat it? I appreciate your help on that.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say we have a close partnership with OCS, Office of Children's Services, and they do amazing work. And so this is not a slight on them at all. But there could be more transparency there. Sort of Trevor's point is a relatively small population. If we could provide more services, do more sort of interventional services with that smaller number, I think we could really move the needle on child abuse. So that sort of closer connection with the data there would be better.
One of the things I would also add to it is we globally, this should never just be on the state. There's amazing people at the state, and there's so much data there, but the thing that always gets cut back is the analysis of that data. And even as funders, don't always want to fund the analysis of that. Like, we really need to take a pause and go, give data the value and the analysis the value and invest in that. And when we do that, on top of some of the things that just Andrew talked about, the data becomes richer and our services become richer and more effective. I saw a hand back there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a theme that OCS corrections would be another one where if there's money available, we're going to spend it on social workers or corrections on guards, convincing those entities that data analysis is worth the cost is a challenge, I think, because those, and OCS would be the best example, consistently underfunded. It's just hard to convince them to spend us, as a state funders, spend money on data to go upstream or whatever. So that's the theme, I think.
So the comment was that what we just talked about data not being analyzed is the theme, not just in OCS, Office of Children's Services, it's also in corrections, that when there are dollars to be spent, you want to provide it on the direct, because you need guards, you need the social workers to protect the kids, that the easy service to cut first is that analysis, because yeah, you may not get the data, but you're still able to provide your essential service. And I think that is a philosophy. So one on a state level of really looking at how data could influence budget. I don't think we, and again, that's globally, we use data enough to really assess how and what our impact, especially if we're going to really talk about controlling our budget. What we really need to do is, it's not about cutting, and it's more about, why don't we evaluate, we got this much through data, where do we put it? None of us just randomly invest our dollars, or maybe give it to somebody to do it, but either way, we look at the data. We're watching the Dow, like every day probably everybody checks the Dow and do that. I don't think we're doing that on our service level. And again, I'm using we in a royal. We're trying to do more of that. I know the Mental Health Trust has been doing that. We're all doing. Now the trick is, and maybe the summit will help it, is how do we do it more together and guide that and change people's philosophy? Because I also know, and this may be a personal thing, is I also know that there's certain people that don't want the data now analyzed because it would challenge their unconscious bias and or their way of doing things, and they don't want it. That can happen. And we need to address that as well, and making sure that we, as the people, require our leadership to use data and then back it up with the stories. Other questions, comments, feedback? Well, I'm around all 2 days if you want to talk on the side. Thank you for allowing us to share where we've been going. Indirectly, probably some people in the room have influenced what we have and are doing. So thank you for that. And go data.